I found that in life, we often are searching for God, but most surprised when God finds us. God is the finder. C.S. Lewis said it this way: there comes a moment when children who have been playing at a burglar's hush suddenly, was that a real footstep in the hall? There comes a moment when people who have been dabbling in religion, man's search for God, suddenly draw back. Supposing we really found him, did we ever mean for it to come to that? Worse still, suppose that he found us. I've had one of those moments where it felt as if God jumped out of the dark hallway and found me. It was a few years ago when I was speaking at a conference in Nashville, Tennessee, to a bunch of worship leaders. The goal of the conference was to gather those who often lead others in worship to come together and to be refueled, to be trained, and yes, of course, to worship together, separate from their ministry environments. I was scheduled to speak after a rather famous worship leader named Matt Redman. I stood backstage, peeking through the velvety curtain out at the massive audience, diligently waiting my turn. And right before my cue, the song ended, but the singing did not. A crowd of several thousand worship leaders continued to sing in perfect harmony and perfect pitch and perfect tempo. The sound that was coming towards the stage was absolutely unreal. Thousands of trained vocalists singing, but more so men and women who usually lead others in worship were now worshiping God with no obligation or no inhibition. I thought that heaven had opened up. I can even picture the ceiling tiles on the auditorium because I quite literally stepped out to peek up and to see if the sky had opened. It didn't. I crept onto the stage a little bit further, not because it was my turn to speak, not yet, I hadn't been introduced. I just wanted to stand there and take it all in as these worship leaders sang at the top of their lungs, unhindered, unhidden, unbound. Matt Redman stepped back as well, and I could tell he was absolutely aghast at what was happening in the room. After many moments of spontaneous singing and worship, the MC stepped forward and introduced little old me. Hearing my name and my bio read at that moment felt so out of place. Like that old Sesame Street game, which one of these doesn't belong? Which one of these is not like the other? Why me? Why now? Don't say my name. Just let it be. I didn't feel worthy to be there, yet alone speak. I wasn't sure that anything I had to say would be adequate. It definitely felt intrusive. Why? Because God was being worshiped, and nothing felt like it should stop that moment. I want you to get this right off the bat. Worship to God is the awed response, A-W-E-D. Worship to God is the awed response of his people to who he is. In that moment, I saw the awed response of the people worshiping God. It further validated that worship is not merely music. Worship is not the Sunday service. Let's go to worship. Worship is the respectful response of the creation to the all-encompassing magnificence of God. It's more than music. It's more than words. I would even say that worship is that moment where our soul exhales rightful awe to God. I've entitled my message today, Worship is More Than Words. I want today to show you that worship is more than words, more than singing, more than music. Have you ever felt a sense of indebtedness to God? Wishing that you could somehow send him a gift or a thank you note for all that he's done to you. You wish you could run up and hug him. You wish there was a way to express your childlike gratitude for the way that he's saved you, the gifts that he's given you, the provisions that he's given you. Have you ever felt that way? I've definitely felt that way. Perhaps there are some of you who don't know what it's like to feel God. You don't feel him close to you. You haven't felt his closeness maybe ever, or at least for a long time. You realize if you could feel his closeness, you would probably feel a better sense of peace. But he seemingly is far away. Perhaps you've gotten used to the place that God is and used to the place that you are. You've gotten used to not feeling God anymore. There's nothing bad that you feel. There's nothing good that you feel. There's just nothing that you feel. And you finally have gotten to the resolved place of, I guess this is how it's going to be. I know what it's like to go through a season where it feels like God is far away. I also know what it's like to get to the point in your Christian walk where you don't necessarily think about how you feel with him. You just have resolved that he's in his place and I'm in my place, and that's just the way it's going to be. But I have also lived enough of my Christian life to know what I'm missing in those moments. I know what you're missing if God feels far away from you. I know what you're missing if you've simply grown okay with the distance between you and God. You have a relationship, close at times, far at times. It is what it is at times. But what if I told you this morning that there's a way to be closer with him, deeper with him, feel him and experience him more? My hope is that your soul would jump up and say, I want some of that. I want more of him. The man that we're studying, Jonah, he was definitely in a place where he was distant from God, but he desired to get back to God. He knew he had messed up. He found himself in a precarious situation, and he had to do whatever he could to get back to God. That's where we meet our main character this morning. Please open up your Bibles with me to Jonah chapter 2, and we will look at verse 1 through 9 as the main passage we're studying today. We'll back up just a tad bit into chapter 1, Jonah chapter 2. You can follow along in the Bibles in front of you on page 775 or the Grace Chapel app as well. If you're just joining us as we study the book of Jonah, let me just rewind the tapes just a tad bit and tell you where we've been. We just concluded chapter 1. We looked at the first 4 verses in our first study together, and we realized that you can't outrun God. Though Jonah tried to catch a ship heading to Tarshish, he could not flee from the presence of God. In the second week, we talked about how it was God himself who allowed a storm to come upon Jonah's life to upset his circumstances, all the while to prove that God was still in control and that Jonah was not. And today, we're going to pick up after Jonah's been thrown overboard by his own request. He said to the sailors, "Do away with me, save yourselves and kill me." That was his attitude. We're picking up right after the sailors did indeed throw him overboard, all the while asking God for mercy for throwing a guy overboard. That's verse 16 of Jonah chapter 1. Let's pick up with verse 17 at the end of Jonah chapter 1, and then we'll dive into our selection for today. It says this in verse 17 of Jonah chapter 1. "And the Lord appointed a great fish to swallow up Jonah. And Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights." The subject of this sentence is not the big fish. It's not even Jonah. The subject of this sentence is the Lord. The Lord appointed. The Lord that they were crying out to in chapter 1. The one true God, Yahweh himself. This God is the one who appointed a great fish to swallow up Jonah. Seemingly in his sovereign control, he sends this massive fish at just the right time in the grandiose ocean to swim by and see a bubbling little drowning Jonah, only to then swallow him up, all because God was sovereign over even the path of the fish. The Lord appointed the fish. That fish happened to be in the right place and the right time, not based on coincidence. It wasn't just merely ironic, but a sovereign God was directing the storm and the fish. This verse has two pieces to it, good news and bad news. You want the good news first or the bad news first? I hear bad news, I hear good news. Let's go good news. Here's the good news. Jonah's still alive. You ready for the bad news? He's inside of a fish. We think, oh, that's of course he's inside the fish. That just makes sense. No, that does not make sense. Nothing about that makes sense. There should be hundreds of questions coming to your mind about this. How exactly did he get into the fish? What was it like in the fish? What was his skin like in the fish? Was this a scene off of Pinocchio? Did he have a candle inside of the fish? Could he feel anything else? What did it smell like? Was it the smell of good sushi, or was it rotting fish in the intestinal tract of this large fish? You should have thousands of questions. The good news is he's still alive. The bad news is he's in a fish. Yet God divinely shapes the life of Jonah by using the circumstances at hand. God can use all tools, everything, to shape our lives. God took the sea, threw in a storm, took a fish, had it pass by, drowning Jonah. God divinely shaped the life of Jonah, and he did it no matter what it took, even if it meant using the circumstances at hand to get his attention. Do you realize, my friend, that there is no created thing, that there is no human circumstance that is too big for God to intervene to get your attention? No created thing, no human circumstance that God can't come in and change and manipulate and move in order to get your attention. He uses the storm in chapter 1. He uses a large fish in chapter 2, all to get Jonah's attention and to say, that's enough. Stop it. And in our life, he can do the same thing. He can use anything he wants to stop your sinning and to aid you in returning to him. For 3 days and 3 nights, it tells us in verse 17, that Jonah was in the belly of a fish. How does he know 3 days and 3 nights? Again, so many questions should be in your mind. Did he see the sunrise whenever the whale yawned? Right? How did he know when the sun came and the sun went down? 1 hour had to feel like a day. 1 day had to feel like an eternity. And yet he's inside of this fish, somehow recounting, if he's truly the one that wrote this later, he says for 3 days and 3 nights, it was in the belly of a fish. Doing what? Vomiting? Wishing for death? Arguing with God? This is it? This is how it ends? He was waiting. He was waiting. The worst part of suffering is waiting. Waiting on results, waiting on information, waiting on deliverance, even waiting for death. It's the worst part of suffering. It is part of the suffering. Yet in our waiting, God is working and God is refining, and I should say God is even breaking our pride so that we will find greater dependence upon him. God will use our broken circumstances to bring greater dependence upon him. He does, he has, and he always will. Your circumstances may be broken by your own hand. You did something to get yourself in this situation. You are now in broken circumstances. But God can use those broken circumstances to increase your dependence upon him. Your circumstances might be broken because someone else broke them. Someone else's sin. Someone else made a decision. Someone else did something that now causes you to experience a broken world, broken circumstances. God will always use broken circumstances to bring greater dependence upon him. I read an article from a news station about a 61-year-old grandmother who was sliding her groceries across the self-checkout at Walmart, scanning and beeping Her total was climbing. Her name was Sarah Lindgreen. And Sarah realized that as she got to the last package in her cart, she wasn't going to be able to afford it. And it was a large package of steaks that she had promised her family she would cook that night. They would have a steak meal. Knowing she didn't have enough, she looked at the steaks, she looked at the total, she made sure no one else was looking, and she placed them into her bag, completed her checkout, and walked towards the door. The Walmart employee noticed what had happened and stopped her and called the police. She was with her 18-year-old daughter, Danielle, that day, who is autistic and couldn't get her mind around why now Sarah was being taken away to a private place to be questioned. Officer Wenger showed up to question Sarah about what had happened. Danielle, all the while, was outside the door, explaining the circumstance. Listen, my siblings and I just need food. We have my siblings and we have other kids with us. In fact, there were 8 other kids who lived in Sarah's house. Her children and her grandchildren all lived with her. And Sarah's husband had died 15 years prior, so Sarah had become the sole breadwinner for that family. She explained to the police officer, you just get to the point of desperation where you finally do things and you don't even think. Nonetheless, Officer Wenger wrote her a citation. He ran a background check, and he said, quote, there was nothing in her background. She had fewer speeding tickets than I do, said the officer. That's when I decided that she needed help. Sarah left Walmart that day. She drove home with her daughter, no doubt sad and overwhelmed by what had happened, embarrassed. Roughly an hour later, Officer Wenger shows up in front of her house in his patrol car. She looks out the window, sees it, and goes, this is it. This is where they come for me. They're coming to take me away. It's all over now, right here in front of my kids. Officer Wenger gets out of his patrol car, opens both doors and the trunk, only to expose boxes and cans and fresh fruit and vegetables filled to the brim of his car. He goes to the door and he says, I stopped by the local food pantry. I got you everything I could. Sarah said, I can't believe it. I just can't believe it. I'm overwhelmed. I can't believe it. And then she said, I was overwhelmed with a rush of guilt. And she yelled at Officer Wenger, take it back. I don't deserve it. I committed a crime. Take it all back. But Officer Wenger wouldn't take it back. The food was all carried into the house. As Wenger was getting ready to leave her house, he said, I've also talked to the authorities and Walmart, and the citation that I wrote you is void. You don't have to pay it. Don't steal again, but throw the citation in the garbage. And then he said, God is a God of second chances. Take advantage of this second chance. And he walked out the door. Powerful. My friends, God uses our brokenness to lead us to greater dependence upon him. Sometimes our brokenness comes by our own bad decisions. Some of it comes by the rush of guilt, similar to what Sarah felt. The broken world that we live in is overwhelmed. We should be done away with. And yet in our brokenness, God says, no. Be dependent upon me. It's when we are most broken that God's grace becomes more real to us. Jonah, in the belly of a fish, realized the beauty of God's grace afresh. And so in response, he writes a psalm, a poetry. He speaks to God in a sort of prayer, recorded for us in chapter 2. Verse 1 and 2 says this, Then Jonah prayed to the Lord, his God, from the belly of the fish, saying, I call out to the Lord out of my distress, and he answered me. Out of the belly of Sheol I cried, and you heard me. What is he doing in his distress? He's worshiping God. In the moment of his greatest brokenness, thinking it's all over for me, he worships God. Worship is an awed response, A-W-E-D, an awed response to the saving acts and the praiseworthy character of God that should result in a perspective and motive change within us. An awed response to the saving acts and the praiseworthy character of God that results in a perspective change. In his most broken moment, he's worshiping God. Who is he focusing on? God, Yahweh, the Lord, the Creator and the Redeemer, the only true God. Verse 1 gives us the commentary that it is his God. So he finally realizes what he has that maybe he forgot or had spiritual amnesia over prior to this moment. What did he do? The passage tells us that he prayed. Literally, this could be translated as he pronounced judgment. Oh, come on, this is rich. He said what is true. That's what he did. Prayed could be translated in the original language. He pronounced judgment. The only right way to pray is to state the facts about God to God. So here in this moment, he says there is no one more worthy of praise than God. And I will state what is true about God. Oh, come on. That's amazing. You're tired of praying the same old thing, saying the same old thing? Maybe you need to start saying the true things about God. Recount to him who he is. Recount to him what he's done. Pray the Psalms. Pray Jonah's psalm. Tell him what he has done and who he is. State the facts. Pronounce judgment. God, you are God. How foolish was I, Psalm 73, to think for a moment that I could somehow gain something. You are the only one who is righteous. Come on, that's amazing. Worship, my friends, is more than words. Worship is a whole life response to God. It's responding to his saving acts. It's responding to his character. And it should be evident in the way that we live and the way that we pray. And in Jonah's raw state, in his broken state, he cries out to God. He cries out to God, and God hears his voice. Look at the pattern we begin to see unfold in his psalm. I cried, you heard my voice. I cried, you heard my voice. Notice something extremely unique about verse 2. He gives us a pattern of true worship, what worship should be like. First, worship declares to others what God has done. His focus at the beginning of verse 2 is speaking to other people about what God has done. I called out to the Lord, third person, out of my distress, and he answered me, third person. He's telling us, or telling those who would hear this psalm, who God is and what God did. He's worshiping God for being God. Then he changes. Don't miss this. He changes from third person to then moving to the second thing that true worship does, and that is declaring to God what God has done. He says to others what God has done, but now he says to God what God has done. Jonah moves from this third person language to this second person language, this more personal language. I cried out to you. To you I cried out, and you heard me. True worship declares to others what God has done, and it declares to God what God has done. And then what did he do next? He realizes he has God's ear, so what does he say? He does what all of us should do. All of us should mimic his very next move. He acknowledges his sin, no holds barred. He acknowledges his neediness for God after he realizes that he has the ear of the Almighty. Look at verse 3 through 6. For you cast me into the deep, into the heart of the sea, and the floods surrounded me. All your waves and your billows passed over me. And then I said, I'm driven away from your sight, yet I shall again look upon your holy hill. The waters closed in over me to take my life. The deep surrounded me. Weeds were wrapped around my head at the roots of the mountains. I went down to the land whose bars closed upon me forever, yet you brought up my life from the pit, O Lord my God. Jonah was certain that God was the one who had allowed his life to crash. He saw the belly of the fish and even the storm as part of God's sovereign control, disciplining him for his rebellion. If you remember earlier, he said in chapter 1, God hurled the winds at Jonah's ship. If he's the one writing this, he's the one acknowledging God's the one who hurled the storm his way, that got him now into the ocean, that then got him into the belly of the fish. 4 times in chapter 1, Jonah uses this word, hurled. God hurled the storm at me. They hurled me over the side, hurl me over the side. He used that word repeatedly, but he switches words in chapter 2. He switches from the word hurled to cast. Why? He uses a different word to make a clear point. He switches from hurled to cast because this cast has a stronger sense than just plopped in, through my way. Cast is to intentionally dispose of. In other words, he's saying, you disposed of me in my rebellion. You disposed of me into the sea. I cried, you heard my voice, but I rebelled and you disciplined. Verse 4, he says, I've been driven out. It's the same word used in Genesis chapter 3, verse 24 about Adam and Eve being driven out of the garden. You drove me out. This word temple is to represent God's presence. You drove me out and away from your presence. Verse 5, he seems to allude that even creation is against him. Look at all the words he uses. The waters closed in, engulfed, surround, seaweed wrapped around my head. It's as if even creation and all circumstances were against him because God can use anything, all his tools to get our attention. So in this state of being totally helpless, he cries out to God and acknowledges what God allowed to happen in his life. He had to be echoing psalms he had heard previous. Psalm 93 has words so similar to this idea of floods lifted up, the floods lifting their voice, the floods roaring, the mighty thunderous waters. All of these things were true in his life, but the psalmist concludes the Lord is mightier than all those things. And most definitely Jonah himself, from the belly of a fish, is acknowledging the Lord is mightier than all those things. Verse 6, down, down, down I went. Down, the bars closed over me. Literally, it could be translated, you snatched me from the jaws of death. The bars had closed. I was too far gone. Yet, but, and then he points to the idea of God brought me up. Yet you brought me up, but you brought me up. Though I was at the feet of the mountain in the ocean, the bars had closed, the waters had raged. You saved me. You brought me up. Friend, you are never too far from God's reach. There is no sin, there is no shame, there is no guilt. There's no years and years of I did this and no I shouldn't have and it's too late for me that makes you too far from God's reach. Nothing makes you too far from God's reach. And while God had every right to discipline him, and Jonah no doubt knew that, he realizes that God brought his life back up. You cast me out. You disposed of me. Yet you came back and you saved me. It's as if he sees his life as nothing more than just a piece of paper. I was done away with. You cast me out. You disposed of me. You threw me in the sea. You're the one that hurled the storm, cast me out, but then you came back. And you brought my life up. You brought my life up. And you brought me back to you. Come on. I cried out. You heard. I rebelled. You disciplined. I descended. You brought my life up. Verse 7. When my life was fainting away, I remembered the Lord, and my prayer came to you into your holy temple. when I was fainting away. Or it could be translated, when my life was failing, when I was growing feeble. Or literally in the Hebrew, you could translate it this way. I cried out to you, and the throat of my soul closed. We don't even have English words to represent the beauty of what he's trying to say. I couldn't breathe at my soul level because the throat of my soul closed. I was faint and nearly gone. And then he says, I remembered the Lord. Or he says more adequately, the Lord I remembered. In Hebrew, order is everything. He emphasizes, I remembered the Lord, but he puts the Lord first. The Lord I remembered. The Lord is first. That's who I called out to. The Lord is the one who could save me. The Lord was the only one worth calling out to. Remembering the Lord was more than some kind of recollection of him. It was more than some kind of unspoken plea. God, if you'll help me, that'd be great. It was an all-out faith. The Lord I remembered. The Lord I crashed onto, because I needed his mercy and his power and his willingness to save me. I cried, you heard. I rebelled, you disciplined. I descended, you brought me up. I remembered, you saved. As an admonishment that we would not do the same thing he did, Jonah concludes his psalm in verse 8 and 9 with both a warning and a promise. He says in verse 8, those who pay regard to vain idols forsake their hope of steadfast love. Warning. But I, with the voice of thanksgiving, the very voice that I now have, my throat of my soul was nearly closed, but now I will lift my voice to you. You see what he's doing there? With thanksgiving, and will sacrifice to you what I have vowed I will pay. Salvation belongs to the Lord. I remembered, you saved. So what do we do with this? I have 4 concluding thoughts for you. You should write these down. What does a life look like that truly worships God? First, that kind of life, a true worshipful life, values brokenness in me. It's coming to the point where you realize it's good to be broken. It's not good to flaunt your brokenness, but it is good to foster your brokenness. Psalm 51 verse 17, David wrote after his failure, the sacrifices of God are a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart, O God, you will not despise. A true worshipful life, true worship, values brokenness in me. Let me tell you what brokenness is not. Brokenness is not false humility. It's not, oh, woe is me, I guess I just really need God. But in your heart, there's some kind of, yeah, but I guess God kind of needs me too. It isn't false humility. It isn't emotional carelessness. Oh, I'm a wreck all the time. My emotions are all over the place. Rather, we see our emotions as a tool that God uses in a way that we can express deep things to him, receive deep things from him, but it's not emotional carelessness. It isn't being poor for poor's sake. It isn't honesty for the sake of getting something off your chest. We meet people who are just blunt honest all the time, and we say, wow, that person just constantly showing off their broken life as if it's something to be admired. Honesty isn't about getting something off your chest, but it's about being honest with God for the sake of transformation. Not for shock, but for transformation. True brokenness is not apathetic, and true brokenness is not some kind of passive behavior. Well, I'll see what comes. Just so broken. No, that's not brokenness. What true brokenness is it's a fear of God. It's a right view of him and a right view of myself in light of him. It's a servant-heartedness towards other people. We realize that we're not greater than anyone and we can't help but to serve those around us. It's true humility. It's lowering ourselves to be a servant to all and having a right attitude in our heart before God and other people. True brokenness is having an awareness of our sinful past, being at war against sin in our present, and being constantly on guard against sin in the future. That's true brokenness. Second thing is true worship admires holiness in God. A life of true worship to God realizes that God is perfect reality, perpetually perfect, but he is real. He is whole. He is the only God worth worship. There are no other gods except for him. Jonah gets at this in verse 8 when he talks about vain idols. He uses this word vain, which can also be translated vapor. It means insubstantial, purposeless. There are vapor gods, would be another way you could translate it. Those who pay regard to vapor gods, things that are not real, but they act like they are real. A person who has true worship in their life says there is only one God who is holy, and there is only one God who will make me whole, W-H-O-L-E. And so we seek after him and we get rid of all other vain idols or vapor gods. What vapor God are you chasing after? Is it the security of your job? Is it the future vacation you hope to have? Is it the retirement account you keep hoping to add to? Is it the hope of many, many kids and your legacy and grandkids that will make your name great? There's no guarantee of any of these things. While they're all fine things to pursue, at the end of the day, there is only one God who has steadfast love. Everything else this world offers you is a vapor God. He says, don't pursue vain idols, but worship the one true God. The third thing I see from this passage is that true worship strives for nothing between God and me. No self-righteousness, no vain efforts, no God kind of needs me, look what I added to him, no proud merit badges of accomplishments that somehow earn you a way into heaven. Not clothed with anything, not your filthy rags of self-righteousness, not add-ons to anything but the gospel, and certainly not being clothed in the sin and the unrighteousness or the guilt and the shame that you carry. Listen to me. If you find yourself trapped in a place of guilt and shame, you've somehow built up some walls and boundaries around certain parts of your heart. You say, oh, I'm not going to let God go there. He can have most of my heart. And I think a lot of people do this. He can have most of me. And doesn't he have most of everyone? I mean, he doesn't really have everything of everyone because we all have something, some closet, some walled off area, some fenced in place that we don't really let God go to. And I'll give him most of me, but I won't give him all of me. If that's you, I'm telling you, you're not experiencing the life that God is offering you. He said, give me your life and I'll give you something better. He didn't say, give me 90% of your life, 98% of your life. Or only the parts that's visible to everybody else. He said, give me everything. Everything. True worship strives to have nothing between us and God. And Jonah reacts in that way. He acknowledges that there's one true God, and he makes three main commitments to God. He says, I'm going to give you praise and thanksgiving. From my heart, I will give you praise and thanksgiving for who you are. Second, I will make sacrifices to you, which no doubt is a shadow of the sacrifice that is to come in Jesus Christ. We cannot make enough sacrifices to God to please him. Only Christ can do that. But Jonah says, I will make sacrifices to you. And even though we have the cross, which is our ultimate sacrifice, we too should worship God by giving a piece of ourselves, no, not a piece, all of ourselves to him, saying, my life is yours, my words are yours, my actions are yours, my money is yours, my whole being is yours. And the third thing that he promises is he says, I will do what I vowed to you that I would do. I will fulfill my commitment. Christian, listen to me. You gave your word. You were following Christ. You were baptized. You went public with your faith. You said you're going to give him your whole life. Are you following through on that commitment? Does he have everything? A life of true worship strives for nothing between God and me. And finally, I would say this. True worship is only made possible by Jesus Christ. The only way that you and I can have any of these kinds of things is by Jesus Christ being the very one who allows us to have an unhindered relationship with himself. He's the only one that gives us access to holiness and makes us holy. He's the only one that comes and says, oh, I see your broken heart. Be broken upon me, the rock of ages. I will make you whole. Jesus died and stayed in the dark grave for 3 days. Jonah stayed in the belly of the whale for 3 days. Jesus stayed in the dark place, the grotesque place, the place of death, so that you and I could be justified before God, no matter what we've ever done. It doesn't make sense. His grace seems scandalous. It seems too good to be true. How can I have that? Because God paid the price for you by giving his one and only Son, who died and stayed dead and then rose from the dead. And that same power that brought him back from the dead is the very thing that gives you freedom each and every day. What was it like the moment Jonah got out of the whale? We're not there yet. We'll get there next week. But he does eventually get out. Spoiler alert. So he gets out and he sees light for the first time. I was thinking about how I could apply this passage to my life. And I counted one day this week how many times I turned on a light. 26 times. My kids turn on it way more than that. And then they leave it on. There was one day I only turned it on 12 times. So we'll say 12 to 26 times I turned on a light switch. Thinking about that thought, what would it be like the first time you saw light after being in the belly of a fish for 3 days? I thought, what if I used this rhythm in my life of turning on light switches to prompt my own heart to pray something like this? What if every time I clicked on a light, I simply said something like, Lord, will you help me walk in the light? Will you help me live in an unhindered relationship with you? Click, click, click. If I just took one more second, half of a second, did it as I was even walking. Light on, click. God, help me walk in the light with you. Click. Help me live in an unhindered relationship with you. Click. May what I do in this room please you and you alone. Click, click. I can't imagine how our life will be different this week if we lived a life of worship to God, thanksgiving to God, sacrifice to God, and we gave to him what we vowed long ago was his. It would change everything. Will you pray with me? Heavenly Father, we believe that you have given us all of life, all of its goodness. Every good and perfect thing comes from you and from you alone. And so, God, we thank you for your gifts. We thank you for your word. And we thank you for even lives like Jonah that point us back to praise to you because of what you have saved us from. Thank you, God, that we can call to you and with confidence know that you hear our voice. In the name of Christ we pray. All God's people say.